Good morning. Hope you're well. I've just returned from the day of prayer and fasting, the morning session where we have been thanking God for the ministry of Ken and Liz, and asking God to help us to find a successor, a man after God's own heart. And I've come back to do my recording. It was great to be with like-minded people, and I just encourage you in the quiet of your own home, in the quiet of your heart, that you would pray for that man to be revealed to us so that the ministry of the church can continue and God's name can indeed be honoured in Sandhurst Baptist Church. As you'll know, we're doing a series in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, and we're doing the life of David, and we're going to be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 24. If you could now pause and then come back after you've read the chapter, I shall then tell you what I've managed to understand from this particular chapter. So please pause and read the chapter now. Now you might think that we have been here before, and I think you'd be right. Time and time again in the narrative of David's early life, we see this conflict between Saul and David. And we contrast two types of people. David, a man after God's own heart, compared to and contrasted to one who is selfish, revengeful, or as Bible Explorer puts it, a man of no heart. We go Saul, no heart, David, whole heart. I appreciate that this narrative is not everyday life. But as I prepare these studies, I become more and more aware of the way that God protects and keeps us in a marvellous way. In the previous chapter, God had miraculously delivered David by drawing Saul away to fight the Philistines just at the moment when Saul was about to capture David. Excuse me, and I presume to kill him. But Saul doesn't give up, does he, until his dying day. He went back to pursuing David, as we've just read. And as I was studying, I am wondering what is in David's mind all this time, or what would be in my mind in the same situation. I guess that he was hoping that this might be the last time, and that he would be somehow freed from this kind of persecution he was facing. Likewise are you not aware of spiritual and personal enemies who seem to pursue you as Saul was pursuing David. And I don't think I'm taking the point too far here. Sometimes we see victory, but unfortunately, as you are probably aware in your life, if you are like me, things come back time and time again, and will do until we go to glory. And I call it life. That's what life is. Glory with God is the only permanent victory we will find. Life is not easy, and we can face recurring accusation, condemnation, both from within, but also from without. We suffer this. It is what I call being human. So look how this narrative unfolds. David hides in the caves in the wilderness of En-Gedi. From what I have read, there were numerous caves dotting the hills. And it was a good place for David and his men to hide because they could be hidden and they were secure and there was plenty of water around. But guess what happens? You couldn't believe it. Saul needs to go for a toilet break. You know, the Bible is a real book about real people living real lives, and this is part of our daily routine. But I kind of say to myself, surely he could have chosen some other cave. There were hundreds of caves there. It is amazing that he chose the very cave where David was hiding. But we believe that something as basic as this was timed and arranged by God. You know, Saul had absolutely no idea what was happening. He just thought he was alone because he needed privacy. But we learn so much from this narrative about the character of David and Saul. David was still waiting to become the appointed king, and he was living at many levels the life of a shepherd rather than the life in a royal palace. And you know, God was continuously testing David, training him and revealing his heart. See what David's men thought. They thought it was indeed a gift of God. Even the gift of God, the big thing that they'd been waiting for year after year. We've got him, they said. Praise God, they were saying, because God has put this man in our path. And they really did think that it was God that had led Saul into the cave for one purpose only. And it wasn't to go to the toilet. No, it was to kill him, to get rid of him. Now, apparently, on some previous occasion, God had promised David, "Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." Verse 4. The men interpreted the prophecy as this very occasion and truly felt that the prophecy had remarkably come true. Now, I guess you can imagine David's mixed emotion, I'm sure. The fact that he cut off a corner of Saul's robe probably suggests that he was in some way tempted by this opportunity. Would you not have thought the same way? The followers of David thought that their days of hiding in caves will be over and they'll be part of this royal family with all the privileges, living in the palace. Now, we don't know how David managed to cut off part of the robe. Maybe the robe was laid down somewhere else in the cave, or maybe David could be particularly quiet, or with thousands of men in the caves, there could have been a lot of echoing. We don't know, and it's not really particularly important anyway. But, and it is a big but, David decided to spare Saul's life. He could have easily have taken his life because he knew that God's promise said, "You will inherit the throne of Israel." Now, he knew that Saul was in the way of that promise being completely fulfilled. But David refused to take the matter into his own hands. He wanted God and him alone to settle the matter. He refused to do it because he believed that God would do it in his way, his time, and do it right. We know of other times when this was true, such as when Satan tempted Jesus with the world. If only he would bow down to him. And this all happened in the temptation of Jesus after his baptism. The theologian Mayer said it very well. He said this, that David knew not only to wait on the Lord, but he also knew how to wait for the Lord. You know, David was determined that when he sat on the throne of Israel, it wouldn't be because of his action, but because of the work of God. He wanted his conscience to to remain clean, and this comes from knowing God intimately. You would have expected a great deal of bitterness and anger towards Saul, but you don't sense it here. I believe that as David took it to the Lord, he himself received a cleansing from that bitterness and anger towards Saul that must have been building up in his heart. He was able to hand it over to God. And it meant that it wasn't his problem anymore. What a statement that is. I know many people tell you to hand it over to God. But do we leave it there? Do we know what that means? Do we tend to want to take it back? But I believe that the heart of David was being shaped so that he knew what it was to take it to the Lord and let the Lord deal with it. So when he was thinking about the cutting of Saul's robe, you can see how David was troubled intensely. Why? Well, the robe was the symbol of Saul's royal authority, and David felt that he had done something against God's authority, therefore. It's not that David didn't know that Saul was a troubled and corrupt leader. It was obvious, but you honour God in the big things in life by honouring God in the smaller things you do. He was worried about what might appear to be a small thing, cutting off a little bit of cloth from the robe rather than killing the man. But he recognised it's in the small things that you can have the problems. And in a sense, of all the things I have to say today, this was the one that struck me the most. You are created by the small things you do that make you into the person that you are. Now, David, I guess, could have copped out from this dilemma by not killing Saul himself, but saying to one of his men, delegating, so to speak, and getting one of the soldiers to do it. But he restrained them from doing anything against Saul. But the narrative doesn't end there. When he went out of the cave, David announced himself, saying, "My lord the king," to Saul, and he bowed down. I mean, reading the story, you say, how foolish humanly can you be? You might think that it was enough that he didn't kill him, bearing in mind the long history between them. But here we find that he made himself completely vulnerable to Saul by announcing himself when he could have just stayed in the cave a bit longer and then escaped. This bowing down was the attitude of great respect. And David was saying that he trusted God, even knowing how Saul had been pursuing him for a very long time. But such was the relationship between David and God that David knew that God would protect him and fulfill the promise. God's promises are secure. That was already on his shoulders when Samuel anointed him king. He felt that this trumped everything else and nothing compared. David reasons with Saul and does not put him down because he is king. He blames his advisors' voices that Saul has. Don't listen to them, when in reality it was Saul who wanted David's head. He was probably following the principle of one of the Proverbs where it says, love covers all sins. But the prevailing principle was that he would not strike against God's anointed leader. Now, I don't think that this means you should never speak against a Christian leader, because they make mistakes like everybody else. But there is a respect due. But I believe that God was still sending a message to Saul, even in this little episode with the cutting of the robe. And that was that God was taking away his royal authority. back in 1 Samuel 15 verses 27 and 28, where the prophet Samuel rebukes Saul for his hard-hearted disobedience to God. It says that Saul tried to keep Samuel from leaving and grabbed his robe, and a portion was torn away. And when Saul was left holding the torn piece of Samuel's robe, Samuel said, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, one better than you." Now I'm sure that this incident was now in Saul's mind. So see how David once again makes it a case for the Lord's judgment in verse 12. That's the recurring theme. He says, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have seen done to me, but my hand will not touch you." I've kind of tried to sum it up by saying nothing other than sin itself will make me do it. I trust God completely. You know, we will all face situations where we feel as though we are in the right. I'm facing just such a situation at the moment, which is confidential and has absolutely nothing to do with this church. But it's my cry to God, let him judge. It's amazing how Saul once again changes to what appears to be true repentance. We see what appears to be, and I've used that expression twice, genuine contrition, when he weeps aloud and he says, "You are more righteous than I," in verse 17. He even goes on to extol the character of David. He knows the future. Verse 20, what he says is very true, and indeed prophetic, when he says that the kingdom of Israel will be established in David's hands. But you know, it's the future and the actions which will prove the character or the characters. It applies to both of these people in this narrative, and it applies to us. But such is the heart of David that even the request in verse 20, "Do not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family," is honoured, as we shall see later in the series, in the touching narrative of Mephibosheth. So we leave the chapter and all appears to be sorted. But we know that it is not the case. There's still more chapters to be written in the lives of David and Saul. And sadly, this can often continue in our own lives in so many varied and different ways. Have you thought about this? We do the right thing. We act in the right way. We are somehow exonerated, we think. Or maybe we are like Saul and do the wrong thing. But we must realize that on this earth, there will be ongoing struggles that we cannot avoid. However faithful and truthful our actions may be. Yes, we might be relieved and released by prayer from some of these trials, but what we discover in this chapter is the heart of the man after God's own heart, who speaks the truth and is not tempted to step outside his own calling. He trusts God in every way. My prayer is that for us here, that we will also have this testimony. In my own personal issue that I've briefly referred to, I pray that I will learn from what I've studied this week, and I will put such teaching into action in a real way, a real life way. And I ask you, what about you? Will you put that teaching, this teaching, into action? I think we learn in the life of David a massive humility. Think of it, he's not even asked to attend the selection of the future king. He's treated like a little shepherd boy who turns up with the sandwiches when the army are fighting the Philistine champion Goliath. And he continues in this sense of humility throughout his life. Yes, he does sin profoundly with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. But when we read the narrative in the book of Psalms, we observe that grieving heart, that sadness over what he had done, that returning to God. And my prayer is that you will know of this heart and seek God in the quiet privacy of your heart to be the man of God, the woman of God in all circumstances. May God bless you. The reason why I've chosen as the last song, the last hymn, is that we might cry aloud these words, purify my heart. May God bless you.